At Granger, we're for the ones who specialize in saving the day and for the ones who've mastered the art of keeping business moving. We offer industrial-grade supplies for every industry with same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders, all backed by real people ready to help. So you can get the right answers and products right when you need them. Call, clickgranger.com, or just stop by. Granger, for the ones who get it done.
A choice right now, between fear and love. It's just a rock.
Out of the dark night of ignorance and into the shining light of truth.
Expanding reality.
A population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
There's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy.
We empower our experience by insisting on our authenticity.
That's very profound. Very.
Expanding
reality.
Welcoming back to the show, of course, Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott. You are both veterans, and I am very grateful to have you back on to talk about your new work, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. We've just, of course, passed the 50th anniversary of the Pascagoula event. I would like to speak with both of you now about this incredible, the updates that you have, their work, and again, guys, all the ways to find both of them and this new book, subtitled here, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction, will be located down in the show description. You guys know how this works. Reach out. Phenomenal work. It's good to see you both. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working time change into this thing. UK does it a little bit ahead of ours, so it's awesome. So we just do a little coordination day of, and everything works out. This is actually the first year it hadn't really messed with me. It's been like 3 years in a row. I've been trying to figure this time change between overseas out, and we finally got it. So thank you all for being a part of that. So we are here to talk about your new work. So Philip Mantle, if you don't mind, how is everything with you? How's everything going with Flying Disc Press?
Well, like everyone else, we've been affected by the economic situation around the world, but we're still plugging away, and we have a raft of new books in the pipeline for the back end of this year and into next year and even 2025. So hopefully our current book, we've purposely made that in a variety of different formats and sizes, keeping in mind the economic situation. So hopefully there's something there for everyone's, wallet, so to speak. And that is a conscious thing that I'm taking forward with me into next year as well, And it's rather apt that we're recording this today, because today would have been Calvin Parker's 69th birthday. So happy birthday, Calvin, wherever you are.
Godspeed, friend. And I meant to ask you, and of course we were going to open with this. Of course, Calvin Parker, the second in the abduction story, which of course we're going to talk about just a little bit here. He was the final remaining member of that two-part group with Charles Hickson and him, and he did just recently pass. So wanted to talk about that just to give you a little bit of time here, Philip, to reflect on y'all's friendship, because I know this goes so much deeper than just a story with you and him. Y'all were brothers, man.
Absolutely. I mean, Calvin and I linked up initially in 2018, and I published 2 books by Calvin. But we would speak literally every week, on Skype. And in between times, there would be exchanges of emails and things of that nature. It just became a natural thing for me to do. If I thought, I need to clarify that, I'll just send Calvin an email and we'll get to it. And I've almost found myself doing that since he passed away. It's like a reflex, something that I thought I didn't quite understand. I'll ask Calvin. Oh, I can't do that anymore. So I think, we did become very, very close friends. He reminded me a lot of my brother. I only ever had one brother who was older than me. He died some years ago. They had similar character traits and a similar sense of humor, And I told him that, and I was happy that I spoke to him the week before he died. I got him on the phone. I told him how much respect he had around the world. Told him that I loved him, and I also told him he couldn't die. And he said, why is that? I said, well, your wife hasn't given you permission yet. And as poorly as he was, he managed to laugh, So at least his last memories of me will be with a smile on his face. And it was a great guy.
It's beautiful, and it's a beautiful relationship you two had, and you're absolutely right in the sense that his work will live on in his story and his ability to come forward. And you picking this up, you, Philip, are the guy who broke this in my mind. There are a couple. I know Hickson did a book in '83, but there are a few other things that have popped up in there. But you're the man that got Calvin Parker to come out and actually talk about this thing in a way he was comfortable to. And so that is what allowed, you're the man who allowed him to open up and be vulnerable, which is huge. I mean, you're the pioneer of this case, and it's one of the most fascinating cases, and we are absolutely going to get to it. I do want to know, Dr. Scott, were you introduced to Calvin Parker?
Yeah. I talked to his wife too.
What's your favorite memory of Calvin there?
No. That he actually got brave and started talking about it, I guess.
Good call.
He'd spent 50 years not saying a word, and finally he said something.
Heard that. Yeah, no, and beautiful. That's a beautiful thing to take away. Calvin, did you have anything, Philip, that you just wanted to remind us
I'll
about
tell you
Calvin?
one little story, and it sums up the man. I mean, Calvin's mother was in a nursing home. And she was so ill, she got to the stage where she didn't even recognize it. You think that's sad, but even though Calvin was really poorly, really ill, every Friday night he would take his guitar, go to the nursing home and sing for the residents and, to entertain them. And he said to one of our sort of joint colleagues, don't tell Philip because he'll put this on Facebook. And what Calvin didn't know is that I have 3 songs of his, on the record. I've actually got them, and he could sing in tune. Let's put it that way. I won't put them on Facebook, but it showed you what a lovely guy he was doing that when he was seriously ill himself, but then he still had that sense of humor afterwards as well. And that's one of my final thoughts. If you ever think of Calvin, it's that little story that always comes back to me. It really is.
It's beautiful. What a great story. And you're absolutely right. It's one of those things to peek behind this. And Calvin was one of these guys that did not want this recognized. I mean, he initially, of course, the story goes as it goes, that he said that he sort of passed out and didn't want to relay that he was consciously aware of anything that happened. Wanted to be done with this completely, even moved after he came out about it later on initially. And so this whole thing was not for publicity, which makes the story even more compelling. And then, of course, with Dr. Scott's findings as well and beyond Pascagoula, which episode 110 down there, guys. So all the both episodes that they have both been on, episode 4 and 139 for Philip, and Dr. Scott 110 will be located down in the show description. So get more into detail with that, as well as reach out. All of the works that have been contributed to this are going to be located down there as well. So just a compendium of links down there for y'all. So we have some new evidence to come out, but also it's just fascinating when you look back at the case, review it from a few other findings that Dr. Scott has found and brought forth in her work. It's a fascinating thing that continues to get more interesting as you look at it. So I know perhaps it's been told a dozen times, but Philip, if you don't mind, would you just give us a quick what happened that night of October 11th, 1973?
Yeah, absolutely. Calvin had recently got engaged to his fiancée, Waynette, and he bought a new car. And he didn't live in the Pascagoula area. He lived out near Laurel, which is, a good distance away. And he was working long hours. And Waynette said, it'd be nice if you had a regular job. I could see more of you. Now, Calvin's father knew Charlie Hickson. Their families had grown up with each other. So his father said to him, why don't you give Charlie a call? He's a foreman in the shipyard. He might be able to get you a job. So Calvin did that. Charlie said, no problem. We're setting up. So the idea was Calvin would live with Charlie Monday to Friday, paying some lodgings, and then go home on a weekend. So Thursday, October the 11th, 1973, was his first day at work in the shipyard. And he spent the morning, doing health and safety checks. In the afternoon, he was employed as a welder, and off he went to work. On the way home that night, Calvin's driving home. The one thing that both gentlemen liked, was fishing. And Charlie said, "Do you want to do a spot of fishing tonight, son?" Calvin says, "Yeah, absolutely." They went and got some fishing tackle from Charlie's. They set off. They bought some bait on the way. Charlie's giving him directions because Calvin didn't know the area at all. So they're driving down by the Pascagoula River, which is just right next to Highway 90, where they were. The huge bridge goes over the river. They passed a car that was parked up with a couple of people in it. Then they passed a no entry sign, and Calvin remarked on this, and Charlie said, "Don't take any notice," So they set about fishing. The first spot they were in, they got infested with insects, so they decided to move, and they parked up themselves on an old pier. There was an old abandoned little shipyard, and this, so they stood there fishing away. They heard this little buzzing noise first, and then this blue light came from behind them and went out across the water. Calvin thought, "I knew we shouldn't have ignored that no entry sign. It's the police. We're going to spend the night in jail, for trespassing." So they both kind of turned around at the same time. And Charlie actually said in his book, he said, "I remember seeing the look on Calvin's face, And of course, it wasn't the police. This oval object was descending. It was giving off this, radiant light. It had two lights on one end. It stopped about 2 feet above the floor. And then this opening appeared. And the light then became more intense. They had to shield their eyes. These three humanoid figures literally floated out of this thing. They didn't touch the ground, about 18 inches above the ground. Charlie described them as being about 5 feet to 5'4". They were grey coloured. The skin was wrinkly like that of an elephant's. They had no neck, and then outside on the side of the head was carrot-like protrusions, and one out the front. They had long arms with pincer or mitten-like appendages. The legs never moved. It was almost as if they were welded together. Two of these things got hold of Charlie. One got hold of Calvin. And whilst they were terrified, they then became kind of relaxed, but they couldn't move. The only thing they could move was their eyes. They were taken into this thing, Calvin to the left, Charlie to the right. Calvin said he was laid on a transparent table or something of that nature. And this ugly thing, as he calls it, just stood to attention. And as he looked up, an object came out of the ceiling. It said it was about the size of a deck of cards. Stopped in front of him, went around him, making a kind of a clicking noise, went back up. And then he said he felt this presence behind him. And somehow he knew it was a female. And sure enough, a female appeared. To all intents and purposes, she looked pretty much human, apart from the fact that her middle fingers were a lot longer. And she opened Calvin's mouth and stuck her finger in his mouth, which it hurt. And at one point, they removed his lower clothing and his shoes and socks, and they stuck something in his foot, and he said it hurt. They redressed him. He managed to gain his composure at one point and got hold of this female round the head. But she just pointed to the creature. It got hold of Calvin, and he was back outside on the pier. Charlie, he said he was suspended. That's how he described it. He was being suspended. And something came out of the wall in front of him. He said it looked like a big eye. That's how he described it. He didn't see any female creatures. Charlie thought, "I'm going to die. They're going to kill me." And he said, "I hope they get it over with quickly." But this creature then got hold of him, took him back out to the pier, and there's Calvin standing there with his arms stretching out towards the water. Charlie's legs gave way, but he managed to stagger to his feet and shake Calvin. Son, are you all right, son?" And they both turned around to see this thing go off, gone in a flash. So they discussed what was the best thing to do. And at that point, they weren't going to tell anybody. So they staggered back to Calvin's car, which was brand new. I mean, literally brand new car. Charlie opened the passenger door and all the glass fell out. Calvin got in the other side. He said, it took me at least 20 attempts to start it. And he said, it just started first time. So they set off. And as they heading back home, it was Charlie who had a change of heart. He said, no, we got to tell someone. What if these things come back and do this to somebody else? Charlie had been in the army and fought in Korea. So he said, what if this is the start of an invasion? So Calvin agreed, but on one condition. I'm not going to tell them about what happened to me on board. I'll say at that point I passed out. When I saw the creatures coming, I don't remember anything. So Charlie agreed. They pulled into a little store that had a payphone. Remember, this is 1973. He put coins in the phone. In the phone, and the first person, the first place he phoned, this was Charlie. He phoned Keesler Air Force Base, which was nearby, and they said, "Sorry, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring your local authorities." And Calvin's in the car shouting obscenities. He was not best pleased. So they ring the police. It's actually the sheriff's department that handle it. They send a car out to them and they give them a sobriety test, no problem. And they escort them into town to the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. They're both interviewed separately. They're then put in a room together and left alone for a few minutes. Unbeknown to them, there's a tape recorder in the desk next to them. The deputy comes back and takes something out of the desk. They've no idea what it is. And the deputy and the sheriff and whatever you think, we'll have them now. They'll be laughing and joking, But of course, when they played the tape back, they weren't. Calvin's literally crawling up the wall. He's going off his head. So, there's a change of attitude then with the sheriff's department. They tend to believe them and say, well, there's not much we can do for you guys. You better go home. So they say to the sheriff, please, don't let this out. The sheriff says, no, we won't tell anybody. So they go home. The next morning, they get up to go to work. And as they pull into the shipyard, they said there's one or two cars extra there. They hadn't been at work 2 minutes when they're summoned to the boss's office. And the boss said, what the hell have you two been up to? The telephones won't stop ringing. I've got journalists outside. Somehow the story had got out. So they tell their boss. And he said, well, I'll give you the use of our company attorney if you want, Mr. Kalingo. They didn't ask for it. He just offered it. So they were then dispatched to the Singing River Hospital, where they were given, a quick exam. And somebody said, what about radiation? Well, the hospital couldn't check for that, but they said, well, Keesler Air Force Base can. So they are driven to Keesler Air Force Base. They're given the once over with a Geiger counter. There's nothing there. And they say, oh, well, while you're here, gentlemen, why don't you tell us what happened? So they do. They're going. And we have a complete recording of that conversation. There was a stenographer there. So we have the full transcript and all the officers that were there. And then we have the transcript of the secret tape that became known from the sheriff's department. And the story was out. The next day, Dr. James Harder from APRO arrived. And of course, Dr. Alan Hynek, the Close Encounters man. And they reviewed all the data. They listened to the secret tapes. And before Hynek went back home, he held a press conference and said, these two gentlemen are the real McCoy. You should treat them with respect. And Calvin eventually went back home. He ended up in the hospital. He had a bit of a breakdown. And of course, Charlie was the one who was like the torchbearer. He went on to speak about it on television, conferences. He passed away in 2011. Calvin was literally like the Hulk from the 1980s TV series, Dr. David Banner. He was pursued by a journalist, and every time he caught him, he'd move to a different town. But that's exactly what Calvin did in real life. For the first year after the event, he was in the Marine Corps. Not many people know that. And then a journalist turned up at the base he was at. So he went to see his commanding officer, and he said, well, it might be best, son, if you leave. We don't want any of this alien business connected with the United States Marine Corps. So he got a discharge, and he literally, with his wife, Waynette, And later on, their children would move from town to town every time somebody recognized him. There was one point when he used a false name. And his boss called him on one day and said, "You're fired." He said, "What for? I haven't done anything wrong." He said, "Well, your name doesn't match with your social security number, you know?" So that went right on until I contacted him in 2018. Now, I only wanted an interview, you know, but it turned out into something more. And the good thing, kind of, is I didn't know at the time, but Calvin had already been ill. He'd had a stroke and he'd had open heart surgery. And I think in the back of his mind, this was his one chance to tell his story in full, you know, accurately via myself. And he did. But that also led to a lot of other people doing exactly the same thing. So, you know, it wasn't just Calvin's story. It was a whole story for a lot of other people as well. And that's where we end up today.
It's an incredible story. It's easily one of the most interesting abduction cases we've ever heard of, especially all the way down to the beings, a description of the lights on the craft, the other corroborated witnesses, which Dr. Scott, I'd love for you to remind us of here, if you don't mind. There's additional witnesses to that story that took a while to come out. When actually were they able to speak up about this, Dr. Scott?
Well, the first one was Calvin had been videotaped, and it was on YouTube. And someone wrote just a note to YouTube and said, "Yeah, my parents saw that," which, you know, is pretty funny. And Philip got in contact with her, and gave me the mother's name. And this was the first person I'd ever interviewed on the subject. And they're Maria and Jerry Vernon Blair. And when I called, I talked to Jerry just not very long, because he was a skeptic. And he just said something about he heard a big splash and something about a blimp. And then he handed the phone to her. Well, she said that they had been on the opposite side of the Pascagoula from Calvin and Charlie, and had seen something going on, but they didn't know what it was. And then the next day it was in the paper. So that's what they'd been seeing, although they didn't know it. And she said they were a young married couple then. And she said that while they were waiting at where they were for her husband's supervisor to come, and they were going to take a ship out to the oil stations or whatever, and oil rigs and things, and supply him. But the supervisor was late. And so they were sitting there in the car watching over the river and everything. And they saw this thing flying around, and she thought it was an airplane, but she thought it was really, really, really strange, because it didn't go anywhere. It just kept, you know, circling and going here and there. And she kept saying, "Well, the pilot must be lost. What's the pilot doing? Is he looking for something?" And she was confused. And then Jerry decided to take his clothes to the ship. It was about 9 o'clock. And he walked down the pier, and she walked down behind him. And as she was walking down behind him, something flopped up right in front of her on the pier, and it looked like a person. And she was just really emotional about this, but she didn't exactly know why. And so they went on down to the ship. And then somehow, she didn't seem to know what they were doing. About 12 o'clock that night, she said she was coming back from the ship, and she was so scared that she ran back to the car and jumped back in the car. Well, we talked. It was really interesting, because we talked for a long time, talked and wrote. And she was really emotional about part of this, and part of it was a thing that flopped up on the pier. And you could tell she was just loaded with emotion, but she didn't know why she was emotional. And, you know, she sort of suspected, I guess, that something was not quite right, but she didn't know what. And so anyway, we communicated for about 2 years. And then, unfortunately, her husband became sick. And I guess he was kind of knowing he was going to die. And he just before he went on the ventilator. And when he went on the ventilator, he couldn't talk. But just before that, he told her that they had been abducted. And he'd been a skeptic all this time, his whole life. He'd been a skeptic and told her to shut up about it. Don't say anything. Nothing happened. You're, crazy and everything. We went a complete changeover real fast and said, yeah, they'd been abducted. He remembered it. And he remembered a lot of details. Like he remembered afterwards, he remembered the beings kind of, not in a real lot of detail, but he remembered afterwards that they swam across the river back to where the UFO had been. And he said, he called one of them the doctor, and he said he pointed to his eye and said he kept his eye on that one. For some reason, she wasn't sure. And so anyway, it turned out that they might have been abducted too. And there might have been a double abduction, which would be really, really strange. And when Marie saw that thing flop up, well, she said actually, she remembered more about it later, that it was a being and that it got her in control. Her mind, controlled her mind and made her forget what happened and things. But all this time she'd had all this emotion, but she didn't have any idea why she had the emotion. And so later she had a hypnosis session and remembered more. And it was kind of funny because her husband said he'd been in contact with these beings for a long time, but he didn't say anything about it. He was always a skeptic. Maybe other people are like that too. And so she had, something to worry about with her husband too, because he'd been, in contact with these beings a whole lot. He'd been through several marriages. Her hypnosis session said they were interested in DNA and eggs of hers. And in the hypnosis session, she said the beings wanted to make hybrids of themselves that would live among us. And she said some people aren't real, they are hybrids. And that she was worried about her husband, worried about DNA and everything. So it was quite a complex account.
It's so interesting. And it's almost like, so let me just real quick, did they remember physically being on a craft or just being messed with that time whenever they were swam across the river? The being swam back to the craft?
He remembered being on the craft, but I don't think she did. I think she said something about she kept her eyes shut and she just looked at it from outside. I don't think she remembered being on it. Maybe she did it in hypnosis because she was talking about them taking her eggs and stuff. But I think so far as consciously that she didn't really remember.
Yeah, it's like they almost creep up, they get you, take over your mind, and you remember that bit of that transition from your consciousness from this odd thing flopping on that deck. And I could imagine, right? Could you imagine that? They're out there in the dark, by the way, looking out at the water, this thing, and it flops up on the wall. I mean, terrifying. And then to think that you could see, oh no, I'm going under. It's almost like when the doctors ask you to count back from 10 whenever you're going under anesthesia. I don't know how far I get. I maybe get to 9. I've had anesthesia like one time, but they said, yeah, you never get far. But it's sort of like that moment where something's happening. But imagine that you under anesthesia in this example. I knew I was going under. They had no clue what was happening. Anybody, and it's just interesting whenever you think that they snuck over, apprehended consciousness, did what they did, didn't need to sneak around anymore. So do you think that they were carried back over the water? My question is, do you think the craft came to them to come abduct them on this side of the water, or do you think that they were floated across? Because neither one of them were soaking wet, like they were submerged to get to the craft. But the entities were seen going back in the water to get back to the craft. Do you see what I'm asking?
I don't know because, okay.
I mean, what Maria, her conclusion was that the abduction that night was planned for them and not Charlie and Calvin. Oh. Because Maria and her husband, Jerry, had planned to be at that location at that time. He was taking the boat out, and they were just late. His boss was late. Calvin and Charlie, on the other hand, only decided driving home that night to go fishing.
Yeah, it was like their second spot, right?
Like they were like collateral, so to speak,
That's fascinating.
And of course, then Jerry Blair saying that he'd been in contact with them previously as well. So that's her conclusion. She doesn't know for sure. And when I first spoke to Mrs. Blair, Maria, before I handed her over to Irena, she said, she says, I've often wondered if something similar didn't happen to us that happened to Charlie and Kelvin. And I said, well, why do you think that, Maria? And she said, I can see something out of my peripheral vision, but I can't quite make it out. This is with the emotional part that Irena was talking about. She was very emotional about it. As we progressed and as Irena discussed things with us, it wasn't from her peripheral vision. It was one of these creatures that got hold of her, and she'd closed her eyes, and she was literally peeping through her eyes. And it was that little bit that she could see, not out of the side of her eyes, but she literally screwing her eyes up, and she said on several occasions now, it put her out almost instantly, but she still had time to get that little glimpse of what was happening. And and of course, she also knew the area. So when she's saying this is an airplane, she knew there's no airfield there. This thing was coming down as well, and there's nowhere for it to land. But she's still trying to rationalize it. She didn't instantly say, oh, look, there's a UFO. Same with Jerry. He kind of dismissed it and said, oh, well, it must be a helicopter then. Or, like he said to Irene, it must have been a blimp. But again, there's nowhere for a helicopter in that area, So it just made it more and more fascinating as time progressed, and that was Maria. And in our book, of course, there is the whole transcript of Maria's hypnosis. What I should say is, we told Maria first off, forget about hypnosis. Your husband's not long died, but she asked us again, so we said okay. So we arranged for a hypnotherapist, a professional, to come to Calvin Parker's house, because Calvin had been under hypnosis before. He now knew Maria, that they were friends, and it would be conducted at Calvin's house. But we never told the hypnotherapist anything about the subject matter. She was just given a date, a time, and a location. And of course, we had it filmed. I hired a professional cameraman to film it. One of the things you see when you run the film back is the look on the face of the hypnotherapist when Maria starts talking about these things, because she had no idea, And Maria was emotional during the filming. She took a long time from question to answer. She kept saying, I miss my husband. My husband's not here. But then a few weeks later, we used the same hypnotherapist to put Calvin under hypnosis. Obviously, she knew a little bit about it now. And we did this simply because we had the opportunity to do it, and we filmed it. Thankfully, we now have it for posterity.
Yes.
So I said to her, ask Calvin this question for me. Before he stood on the pier with his fishing rod and his line in the water. Before anything happens, just describe the scene in front of him. So she asked him this question, and he said, yeah, there's the bridge over there. Of course, there's all the traffic going over it. There's a boat going out. He even told me the name of the boat, the company name. And right at the end of this little description, he says, oh, there's two people on the other side of the river, two figures on the other side of the river. Now, my question to that is, was this Mr. and Mrs. Blair, or was it somebody else? I mean, we'll never know,
It brings up so many more questions, especially, of course, now you've unturned another stone with this, but it brings up so many more questions because, yes, was Calvin and Charles's experience sort of, like you said, collateral damage because they were sort of an incidental, but there was traffic going by. There were people on the boat. Like, did y'all track down the people on the boat that night and see if they had some weird stuff? Because it seems to be, what's the sphere of influence for collateral damage, if that's what it was? It's just interesting.
One of the criticisms back in 1973 was that no one on the bridge that night saw anything. Well, that's the wrong thing to say. No one on the bridge that night has come forward
Right.
However, there was a gentleman who we interviewed, with Mr. Charles Rusty Anderson. He said, I was driving over the bridge that night with my wife. And he said, I saw this white blue thing. Calvin, Charlie saw the blue lights down below me. And he says, I thought, whatever it is, it's going to crash. It was that low. He said he watched it for about 30 seconds, which is a good time to view something. The following day, he went to visit an aunt who lived down by the river. And before he could open his mouth, she said to him, you'll never believe what I saw last night. Yeah. So we didn't, the aunt's long gone, but we did interview Mr. Anderson, and he's in the book. And what is interesting, Irena and I have been consultants on a new documentary that's being made by a UK company. And they were over in the States last year filming, and they interviewed Mr. Anderson. So he put a little post on his Facebook, I've just been interviewed about my UFO sighting. You trail down the comments on it, and there's a lady there saying, oh, I saw the thing that night. So I got in touch with her, and she told us. And what we did find out, she was actually the cousin of Mr. Anderson. And she didn't know he'd seen something, and vice versa, And then another example how things just work with this case. Calvin was doing a book signing in Pascagoula. An elderly gentleman with white hair steps up, I'll have a book, Mr. Parker, there you go. And he says, oh, I saw the thing that night. And off he goes. He's always got his signed book, and off he goes. Luckily for us, someone was taking photographs. And we have a picture of this gentleman buying the book. We didn't know who he was, so we put it on social media. A lady contacted me. She says, I know who he is. And I said, well, will you ask him if we can talk to him? And he come back and said, yeah. It was a chap by the name of Mr. Lewis Lee. And Mr. Lee, again, was on the other side of the river that night, but this time in the shipyard he was working. And he was a crane driver. And he said, Philip, my cab is about 10, 12 feet off the ground. And he says, as soon as I got in it, I could see this darn thing out across the river. He said, I've never seen anything like it in my life, And he said, I watched it for some minutes. And the only reason he took his eyes off it is because his colleague down below him is shouting, what are you doing? And he had to see to his load or whatever it was they're doing. He said, when I looked back, it was gone. And I said to Mr. Lee, did you report it to anybody? He says, Philip, this is 1973. You can't call Ghostbusters, He said, I told my family about it, and that's it, Sadly, Mr. Lee has passed away since we interviewed him, but his interview is in our book. And, following on from Calvin telling his story, Irena and I were really on I'll say a mission. It's probably the wrong word, but I'll say a mission to document these other sightings, these other bits of information before it was too late. Had we hesitated and not bothered with Mr. Lee, his story would have gone untold, because people are reaching that stage in their lives, and so on. And same goes with Calvin, of course. I think he realized, even when we first started talking, that there was something else other than his heart problems brewing. I think he had an inclination that, because he used this phrase to me, he said, we all have our own expiration date. And I think in the back of his mind, he thought, well, I've only got this chance now to tell my story. And of course, that's exactly, what happened. But, more and more people came out of the woodwork. It's or we found them. Some people say, like Jerry and Maria Blair, they only want their 15 minutes of fame. They didn't want anything. It was their daughter that made that comment on YouTube. Had she not made that comment, we probably would never have found them, So they didn't step forward. We found them. And thankfully, we've documented what they've had to say.
It's brilliant, and you're like the Batman of these investigations. You have the best luck when it comes to this stuff, but you're also so tenacious with this. I remember every time you've come on, the part of the reason I love having you on is to hear the connections you've made through your detective work to find these obscure, incredible additions to cases that are just so much more fascinating as you add the pieces to them. So like you said, yes, if these parts of this, because Jerry and Maria's case now, I mean, it's so interesting because, and just to what you said about your hypnotherapist, I'm thinking of Bud Hopkins and how he used to bring people to hypnotherapists, and like Dr. Clymer, one of his long loved ones, but the first time that he met, he was interviewing all these different hypnotherapists, and I just picture their faces, because he didn't tell them anything either. He gives them very objective view, just here, give me a date and let them go loose on it, and then the shock on these people's faces, right? But like Bud Hopkins as well, it ties into the Blair's case, because now if we're talking about genetics, I'm thinking of Intruders, of course, and the Copley Woods event. And it's silly, though, and so I kind of want to bring this up. So let's talk about the hybridization real quick. What do you guys think to that element of the story, that there is some sort of genetic material being taken and that there is some sort of race being created? Just feel free to speculate wildly here, but there are quite a few reports of this being in the narrative. So I don't think can't be part of the conversation. What do y'all think? Dr. Scott, we'll turn it to you first.
Well, I think nobody has an emotional reaction to it because it's so creepy and it comes from hypnosis. And so everybody said, well, it couldn't possibly happen, but it might happen. And she kept saying some of the people here aren't real, that they're hybrids. Maybe that was her husband for all I know. And they may be distributing their DNA to us and things. So it was pretty creepy, but, you don't know if it's true or not. I mean, if it is, it's really creepy.
It is, or it's a cover story. Maybe it's a mental cover story that's implanted, which I don't know why anybody's able to remember anything on this. I have my own theories about that, like we all do, but maybe it's something planted because there's something worse going on. Maybe they're like, just tell them it's a hybridization program kind of a thing, and perhaps it's a seeded memory of some sort, just sort of a consideration, sort of a take-home bag of just some sort of narrative, but it does pop up. That, the atomic weapons thing, all of this seems to be part of this strange narrative that just gets more bizarre when you really niche down into each in particular case.
And of course, Bud Hopkins played a significant role in this case that a lot of people might not be aware of, because in 1993, Calvin had another encounter, this time on his own. He was out fishing in a little boat. And I won't go through the whole story, but when he got back home, and he was talking to a friend of his who had a bit of knowledge about the subject. And he said, do you know Bud Hopkins is in Florida this weekend at a UFO convention? So they literally got in the car and drove to Florida unannounced. And Calvin wouldn't go in because the convention was in the hotel. So his friend went in and found Bud. I mean, I knew Bud pretty well. Bud said, here's my key to my hotel room. I'll meet you there in an hour or whatever. So they met, and Calvin submitted to hypnosis, and we managed to find the tape. And it's not in this book, it's in a previous book. But again, through our research, we found that Charles Hickson had undergone hypnosis twice with Bud Hopkins in different years. And again, we managed to obtain copies of the tapes. And what is interesting is Charlie had 2 encounters as a young fella, as a young boy. So did Calvin. He had 2 encounters when he was a young fella. And the common denominator, as far as Calvin was concerned, through all 4 encounters now, was this woman, this female. She was in all 4 of them. Now, make of that what you will, but it just, again, the story expands even further, because if we're honest, prior to me contacting Calvin, all we knew was of their 1973 incident and the Sheriff's Department and Keesler Air Force Base. That was pretty much it, but it is now grown to be so much more. And here's another little thing. Irena and I mean, we didn't set out to write a book, and it wasn't our intention. It's just we wrote a number of articles. As we found things, we'd write an article about it. We, going to write so many articles. So it became a book in the end, And I have to be honest, we edited it several times because new information would come forward. I think, we'll have to stick, the beauty of digital technology is you can just, cut and paste. So in August, we finally said, that's it. The book's coming out, that's it. No sooner had we done that than a lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Prince from the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi contacted me. Now, one of her colleagues, part of the Historical Society, knew that Chelsea was interested in the Pascagoula case. They have a Facebook page. She put a couple of things on it now and again. And she said to her, do you know, I've got 2 boxes of correspondence and stuff that used to belong to Charles Hickson. What? She says, well, do you want them? Yes, please. This lady was called Bethany Fayard. And Bethany's parents actually bought Charlie's house when he died in 2011. This stuff was left in it. There was a lot more. She'd given some away some years back and she couldn't remember who took. So Chelsea said to me, do you want it, Philip? I said, well, yeah. So she digitized it all for me and Irena. Irena still hasn't been sent a copy, by the way. I've still got it here. But there's like 1,500 scans. So there's no smoking gun in this. But what there is some fascinating little pieces. There is an unpublished pencil sketch of the UFO by Charles Hickson, which to me I find fascinating. It's a little piece of history. Yeah. He also does a bullet point. There you go. Irena's showing
you, Dr.
it.
Scott, look at that. Video version located down below, guys.
There's there's a handwritten 1 to 20. And he writes the description, like how big the nose was on this thing, how big their chest was. Yeah, I think he said it's 44 inches. Then there's correspondence from people. One of whom is Bud Hopkins. Others letters from Betty Hill, because Charlie and both Calvin met Betty Hill at different times, And one little a letter I did find is from a gentleman who was a NASA physicist. And I've checked it out online. There's his full letter, And he says to Charlie, this is written to Charlie, he said, I approached my bosses at NASA when this incident happened and asked them to investigate it. And he said they were not interested. So opportunity missed as far as NASA were concerned. But curiously, on this letter was his address. And I know it's going back some years, but so I've written to the address, and so far he hasn't been returned. So you never know. He might still be alive. He might be an old NASA physicist sitting in his armchair somewhere. But these were little. So it just goes to show you that the investigation hasn't ended. There is other things out there. And Irena just interviewed a gentleman just recently who we found talking about where the UFO might have been, Irena.
Well, he saw this UFO. He said it was at that time, and he was driving over the road, and he looked down, and he saw this thing flying around. And there is, everybody mentioned there's no airport there. And he said it didn't fly, in a logical fashion. It was just flying around like it wasn't doing anything. And then it took off and flew away. Well, he said that he knew it was a government, that it wasn't anything else, and that it had to be the government and so on. So he didn't believe in UFOs or anything. But so he still saw something and he still reported it.
Yeah.
And this would have been about the time when the abduction and everything took place.
What do you guys think to that argument of his thesis on that? Do you think it's even possible that maybe even some hybrids work with the government, or maybe our government is all aliens and they just kind of have human suits on and then they really go out and abduct people every now and then? Do you think that there's anything to that?
Well, I know British author Nick Redfern. Nick lives in the United States.
I know Arlington, actually Texas, right down the road from me, I think.
Yeah, Nick believes it was a military experiment. It's got nothing to do with aliens. It was a military experiment. It's in one of his books, and he gives other examples of other alleged military experiments. First and foremost, why would you do it so close to? I mean, the area that this is not in the middle of nowhere. It's right next to the main highway. You know, as we said, when they're driving into the fishing spot, they pass another car that's already there. You know, it's got a young couple in it, you know, doing what young couples do, but it's not out in the Mississippi swamplands. And
the answer I'd give to that, give to that is government use contractors all the time. So this could be like a government contracted ship. It just could be, oh yeah, we work for the government, but we're not affiliated with them. Sort of, send that ship out. We can't send the camo guys out and the Black Hawk helicopters. Let's send that, UFO out and those creatures and put the guys in the suits and all that kind of thing. Because weren't there injuries go ahead, please. Well,
the injuries we'll come to that in a second. But yes, what we also found out was that whatever happened at Pascagoula wasn't an isolated incident. There was a huge wave of sightings across the United States that year, and it was later written up, I think it was Walter Webb, in a book, The Year of the Humanoids, and I've just published a book by Kevin Randall, and it's called 1973. The Year of UFOs, Landings and Abductions. So if it was an experiment, it was a year-long one that went right across the United States. And it may have peaked in October, And you mentioned the injuries there. When this incident took place, Charlie said that these two creatures grabbed hold of him and he felt a scratch. He thought it might have been an injection, but he felt a scratch on his arm.
And didn't he hear a little air sound as well? There was sort
this was Calvin said that. He said he heard this little psh, psh. But when Calvin was on board this thing, he said they took his lower clothing off and his shoes and socks and they stuck something in his foot and it hurt. And he said it felt like they were drawing the life out of him, like they were sucking the blood out of him. So when I started working with Calvin, one of the things I said to him was, he was writing the manuscript at this time. Have you got any photographs, Calvin? Any documents? Not a thing. He said, we lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. Because his house is literally, 60 feet from the river. And his house was under 10 or 12 feet of water. So it was all gone. So what I did, I sent out blanket statement requesting anything, basically. And the Center for UFO Studies contacted me, obvious place to start, because Hynek was on site in 73. They sent me a PDF file, mostly newspaper cuttings, but we're grateful for them. But in the middle of this lot of stuff, what is a one-page typewritten letter. So it's done on an old typewriter. And the reason we know that is because it says the date on the top. And they've gone over the date. They've typed over it. They've made a mistake and gone back and typed over it. So it's October the 13th, 1973. And it's called Puncture Wounds. And it details Charlie and Calvin being stripped down to their underwear, being given a once-over, and that they find, in inverted commas, puncture wounds in Charlie's forearm and in Calvin's foot. And it talks about photographs. Well, there were no photographs for it, but I thought, this is a fascinating little document. So I said to Calvin, who stripped you down to your underwear? And he says, it was Dr. Harder. He just asked us to do it. He wasn't a medical doctor, by the way. He was a doctor of engineering, but at least he did that. So it must have been, I don't know, a year or more after this, could be longer than that, without referencing the book. I can't remember exactly how long. But the same gentleman, Mark Rodiger, at the Center for UFO Studies, sent me an email. Says, Philip, I've been rooting through some files today. I wasn't looking for this, but I'm sure you've already got this, but I thought I'd better send you it just in case. And hey, presto, it is the photographs to go with that document. And you see Charlie's arm, his forearm with these marks on it, and Calvin Parker's foot. And we know, because there's no face, there's no head on them, but we know who's who because it's a photograph and they've written the names on the back. and that's been scanned as well. So here you have Charlie and Calvin saying they felt minor injuries, little pricks and scratches. Then you have a letter typed by Dr. Harder, and then we have the photographs. And they're all in the book. The photographs are published in our book for the first time anyway. I think it's a compelling piece of evidence. I really do.
It is. Physical evidence is always a compelling piece of evidence, especially when you think that they were, to the Blair's case, they don't seem to have any physical contact with them, but they were under some sort of spell by the time they physically reached them. But it seems that Calvin and Charles needed to be physically apprehended before they were subdued, because once they were grabbed, they were kind of, But it's interesting just to add that bit of a detail, because it's such a clunky bit of technology. If that's what occurred, if that's what it was too more, because they got more passive once that poke happened, allegedly, but or even just the contact. But this is like the interesting part about it. You have two similarities as far as the outcomes, as far as fatigue goes, and apprehension and unwillingness to fight or flight. You just freeze and go. And then, but two different mechanisms, and seems to be in which they were instilled, but by the same event, by all regards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
interesting.
And again, none of us knew this when we started. None of us knew any of this. And, there's certain parts of the encounter Calvin, didn't like talking about. It's kind of generalizing. And that part about him being undressed, it embarrassed him amongst a lot of things, and Calvin was a tough young fella, used to sticking up for himself. He told me, he said, I was at school with my younger brother. He said, if anybody picked on my younger brother, they had me to deal with, But here he is lying helpless and cannot do anything about it. And that preyed on his mind, whereas Charlie was the opposite. Charlie was 42 years of age, was a veteran of the Korean War, saw some quite severe, action. And so he had that to fall back on. And he said, he says in his own book, he said, I thought these creatures were going to kill me. And I just wanted it over with. But then he went back to his time in Korea, and he said, we were pinned down by enemy fire. And I think he said his captain was there. And his captain says, stay calm, don't worry. An opportunity will arise for us to get the hell out of here. And it did, So then, instead of thinking about they're going to kill me, he went to thinking back to his military mode. I'm going to stay calm, the opportunity is going to arise, and I'll be able to get out of here. Whereas Calvin had none of that to fall back on, none of it at all. I mean, it may sound strange to people today, but one of the things Calvin was really, really worried about was he just got engaged. And he was worried that if this story got out, his future father-in-law wouldn't let him marry Waynette. Because Waynette was only 16 at the time, so they needed, parents' permission. Calvin was only 18, And it seems kind of strange to us in today's modern society, but that was on his mind as well. And, the whole story has just opened up and gets bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes by. And I don't see it ending anytime soon. I really don't.
Well, on that note, we're probably going to wrap it up here, and thank you for that. I don't see it ending anytime soon, and here we go, signing off here. But I just kind of want to get a bit of fun information from both of you through all of your investigations. It can be on this case or not. And again, as all the ways to find them, both the books, their first appearances on the shows, all of that kind of stuff, located down in the show description. And thank you both for being here. I find it funny, though, in some of these cases, and I'll bring back to Intruders, the Bud Hopkins work here for a second, that in that hybridization program, right? It says terrible, horrible stories within that book. Highly recommend. In fact, I'll link it below. Everybody get a copy and check it out. But within there also are some beautiful nuggets of that you kind of call into question what the hell these things are and their intelligence, if that is what we're dealing with here, rather than just some sort of technology that some dorks kind of know how to use pretty well, right? The point is, and I'll ask you guys if you have any examples in your findings, is the cases of men who have had vasectomies that they pick up for breeding programs, and there have been many. Have you guys heard of these cases?
No.
They're wonderful because they pick these human beings up for the specific reason of breeding them in their hybridization program. They'll take the sample after an interesting event, sort of like Andreas Villas-Boas's event, and then they'll take that sample over, and then they'll say after some time a large entity comes by and looks at him very angrily and sort of gives him the boot out of the UFO and sends him on his way. And this has happened multiple times. They say, to Bud's case, they'll say, Bud, he looked at me like he was really angry and disappointed. My question is, if this is such an elaborate, amazing thing, you'd think that they could scan you to see if that was a modification that you'd undertaken before they go through the pageantry of dragging you on board. And there are multiple cases of this occurring. So it's sort of like a trial by fire, I guess, pun intended, hit and miss kind of thing here. But what do y'all think of that? There's some clunky elements to the UFO phenomena that I find
Well, it's
buffoonish.
a bit like they'll say, oh, my memory's been wiped. I can't remember what happened. But then they go on to hypnosis and they remember it. Now,
Right.
Surely if these were aliens, they'd know by now that we can use
That we can
hypnosis.
do that, right?
So what is the point of arranging the memory in the first place?
Great
It doesn't make any sense. What I will say is, when I first started in the abduction side of things, was way back in the 90s. And a local lady near to where I live, I interviewed many times. She had a whole series of encounters. And I worked with Bud on this particular case. I would literally transcribe the interviews I had with her, put them in the mail to Bud. He'd have a copy. And he'd read them, and then he would send things back. Now, one of the things that, as you're talking about the hybrid thing, Bud was talking about a little bit later, this lady said the same thing. She said she'd had these phantom pregnancies and the baby had been taken away, and she'd then been taken back and shown it and said, this is your child. And she said it looked like a cheap child's doll with this awful cheap hair on it,
Yeah. Like it had
And of course,
radiation sickness or something.
That was exactly what Bud was talking about. And he nicknamed these smart baby dreams. But there was no way this housewife from England knew anything about that, but she was reporting exactly the same kind of thing that Bud was working on and hadn't yet published. And I only knew about it because of my correspondence with him. And I had him come speak at our conferences and things like this, but it was before he published it. So how the hell does a housewife on the other side of the Atlantic report something pretty much the same as a whole array of young women in the United States that are only known to Bud? I don't know. Perhaps there is an answer, but if there is, I don't know.
It's wild. It just seems like an oversight almost on their part that there are these types of things that can occur. And then as well, too, you said that they're able to be actually recalled somewhere. And Dr. Scott, to what you said about the visceral reaction Miss Maria Blair had to her memory of the beast coming out of the water, whatever it was, there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's basically that all the memories are stored here. And so you will get this visceral reaction that'll light you up, even though you don't have any conscious memory of it. That's what occurs a lot of times with these. And especially, I think, whenever someone sees something off or something on a movie that flashes for a second, they get terrified, it almost unlocks that petrification that occurred from some event that they don't consciously recall. It's just very interesting. Dr. Scott, before we end here, do you have any interesting, I guess, anomalies that just you're puzzled by whenever it comes to some things in the UFO phenomena?
Well, I interviewed Bud Hopkins once, and I put it on YouTube. And I don't remember if it was part of the interview, but he said sometimes they can delete the memory of a whole group of people, not just one at a time. And he was talking about, I think it was a school or a military establishment, something like that, where everybody forgot something. And so, the abductions and things may be massive, and they may be a screen memory too, for all I know.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it just keeps getting more mysterious, which is why I'm grateful you two are out here absolutely crushing it at the work that you're doing. You're bringing so much more light to these cases. You're making us ask so many more questions, which is always fascinating. So thank you both for your time. Everything, of course, all the ways to find y'all located down in the show notes. Look forward to doing it again.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll probably get back to you when the documentary comes out.
Absolutely.
Because a number of these witnesses have gone on the camera this time for the first time ever. So I look forward to seeing them myself. I've only found them at the end of an email or a telephone line rather than on video. So we'll get back to you when that comes out.
Please do. I'd love to check it out, and congratulations on that as well. That's incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
At Sleep Outfitters Outlet, great sleep is a big deal. Save 40 to 60% every day on every Sealy, Stearns & Foster, and Tempur-Pedic. Queens as low as $249. Customer exchanges, closeouts, and floor samples. Inventory changes daily, so come in for your dream deal today. With no credit-needed financing, expert advice, and up to 60% off retail, it's never been easier to get the sleep and savings you deserve. Go to sleepoutfittersoutlet.com for financing details and to find a store near you.
For the ones who get it done, the most important part is the one you need now. And the best partner is the one who can deliver. That's why millions of maintenance and repair pros trust Grainger, because we have professional-grade supplies for every industry, even hard-to-find products. And we have same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders. But most importantly, we have an unwavering commitment to help keep you up and running. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.